Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CPMC's webinar, Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, on this Wednesday afternoon or morning, depending on what coast you are on or where you are. Today, we are really excited about this, as it's kind of the first of its kind for us, and the launching of a kind of an initiative that CPMC is involved in terms of when it comes to the question of advocacy and advocacy work, especially within the church, surrounding issues related to the criminal justice system. And so today we are joined by five very talented panelists and representatives of national Catholic organizations. Actually, I know I'm counting four right now, but possibly we'll have a fifth join us here in a couple of minutes. These organizations are working daily, weekly, monthly for legislative change within the prison and detention systems and eliminating the death penalty. Our presenters, I will certainly will have them introduce themselves here in just a bit, but just to go ahead and start that, we are joined today by Tom Mulloy of the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States, Ingrid Delgado, I think we could say a friend, an acquaintance, a friend that I've known for some time, who used to work here at the Florida Catholic Conference, where I'm in Tallahassee, and she's now up in DC with the USCCB. And then we have Christy Williams with Catholic Charities USA, and Tacke with Catholic Mobilizing Network. And so I am certainly thrilled to be a part of this conversation and to learn from you all today about the ever important work of advocacy that we have been called to certainly by our Lord, and certainly now through the working in the ministry of the church here in the United States. But let us begin and open this webinar in prayer. Good and gracious God, we thank you for the gift of your Son. We thank you for the gift of the church. And we especially thank you for the gift that you have invited us to participate in the ministry of Jesus Christ, of bearing witness and shining the light of the gospel to each person, but especially, Lord, we thank you for the gift of calling us to the important work of ministering to those that are incarcerated, our brothers and sisters that are incarcerated, and to those that are re-entering back into society. We pray this day that you would bless our panelists as they share their different missions within their different ministries. And we also pray that you would bless all of those participating in this webinar in their ministries, wherever they are. We pray all of this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. Okay, and before we do start with you, Tom, I would also to invite all of those that are participating, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit questions in the chat box. And then towards the end of this webinar, we'll have time for Q&A. So as questions come to mind, feel free to enter those in the chat box, and then we'll come to those later on in the program. All right, Tom.
Thank you so much, Father. Thanks to everybody for being here. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here to talk about this work. As Father said, my name is Tom Mulloy. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States in their Office of Justice and Ecology. But I'm going to spend a couple minutes with my partner in crime, Ingrid Delgado, talking about like the foundation of why we do this advocacy, and what are the really fundamental parts of that advocacy. So that's what we're going to talk a lot with the very brief time that Ingrid and I have. So let's just jump right in. When I think about why we do advocacy, I try to root myself in the fact that it is a core way that we can live our faith. And it's a response to our gospel call. God says in Matthew 25, whatsoever you do to the least of these brothers of mine, you do unto me. And part of that is answering, when did you visit me when I was in prison? When did you feed me? When did you clothe me? Policy advocacy is just one of many ways we can ensure that people are fed, people are clothed, people are cared for, people have shelter. And so Matthew 25 is that gospel call is really why we do advocacy. But it's also an appropriate expression of our faith. And I don't think this gets enough attention, so I wanted to spend just a couple of seconds going over it. Pope Benedict, who we lost recently, talks very compellingly in Deus Caritas Est, that we are called to participate in public life in a very personal way. He goes so far as to call it our mission to configure social life correctly. Respecting its autonomy, like we're not going to get into we're not called to become technocrats and get into the nitty gritty of policy making. When should legislation say must or shall versus can or may? Like that's not what we're going to do, but we're called to bring our faith and the values of our faith to the policymaking debate. And I think I'm probably in good company when I say that a ton of policymaking doesn't necessarily reflect Catholic or Christian values these days. And so that's why it's important for us to bring our perspective, because if not, then it's not there. It's not reflected. We can't rely on somebody else or some other entity to necessarily bring an appropriately Catholic response or an appropriately Christian response to policymaking. I also like this part about cooperating with other citizens, because a lot of the work that we do is collaborative, right? We cannot do this on our own. We do this, Ingrid and I and Emma and I and Christy and I and David, we all do these together in collaborations and coalitions. And this is a through thread. It's a through line through Catholic teaching. It's completely consonant and consistent with Pope Francis says. When Pope Francis says we need to participate for the common good, we have to get involved in politics, because that's offering the best of ourselves. It's precisely what Benedict said. And the last thing that I threw in here when it comes to why we do advocacy, I think this is an amazing quote that really gets overlooked, because a lot of times, when we do this type of advocacy, we get tis. This isn't the church's responsibility. It's not the church's. It's not a Catholic's responsibility to talk about criminal justice reform or housing policy. Those are other things. The church needs to stay in its lane. But St. Pope John Paul said the exact opposite. He said, when it's concerning the development of peoples, we cannot be concerned. We cannot be accused of going outside our competence. So when people are involved, when the life and dignity of a human person is involved, when the vibrance and the vitality of a community is involved, that is totally appropriate for us to get involved. Now I'm going to take a break. I'm going to kick it over to Ingrid so that she can talk about more fundamentals of advocacy.
Great, thank you, Tom. And such a pleasure to be with all of you today. In my current role, I serve as a policy advisor for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. I've been here for about a year and a half, but previously I was an associate director for social concerns and respect life for the Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops, where I had the pleasure of getting to know Father Dustin. And even though I'm not speaking in that capacity today, I also have the privilege of being the board chair of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. So just to kind of build on some of what Tom just shared. I invite you to think about this journey, in our lives as Christians, right? This journey of love as walking on the 2 feet of justice and charity. And I didn't make this up. You can actually do a search on the USCCB website for 2 feet of love in action. There are lots of resources you can look through and you can share if that would be helpful. But, it's important to kind of think about, the 1 foot is the charity work, right? The corporal works of mercy, what your ministries are definitely doing on a daily basis, right? Through prison ministry. We are called to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, care for the sick, to provide shelter, to visit the imprisoned, right? Like, this is in the scripture. We can't not do it, right? But it's also really important to think about, why is there hunger, right? And the goal isn't just to continue feeding the hungry, but to end hunger, right? And in order to do that, it's important to, make an impact on structural change, right? And so I know that a lot of your ministries are doing things on the front end, right? The kind of, of helping people create a community that creates safety and stability, to prevent crime, to prevent incarceration. Your ministries are visiting the people who are in prison. Your ministries are there for people when they're, leaving prison, right? And re-entering society. But our ministries alone, right? Doing pastoral work alone is not going to change. For example, if there's a death penalty in your state, right? That's something that has to be done through legislation or through a court process, right? Your state laws and, looking at some federal sentences, right? But it's the laws that are going to decide if your children in your state can be tried as an adult, if they can be housed in an adult prison, what is a crime, how they're sentenced, for how long, right? Those are things that we can only impact through legislation, and sometimes through the executive branch, through rulemaking and things like that, right? What are the prison conditions, right? Those are things where, if you look at these 2 feet, it's really important to make an impact on both, right? Serve kind of immediate needs, those direct services, but also create the structural changes. And together we can really build a just society. And I will mention that, again, there are federal policies and there are state policies, right? And so at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, we're working mostly on federal policy, but your state Catholic conferences will be working on state policy, right? So kind of federal mandatory minimum sentences, right? That's at the federal level. But then there's also, I think the majority of you are probably working in jails or probably working in state prisons. And so it's important to look at, again, justice and charity, but also both federal and state policy. And with that, I'll hand it back to Tom.
Thanks so much, Ingrid. I know we might be running close to our time, so I'll try to speed it up a little bit. But I want to dig in real quick to some of the fundamentals of advocacy, why we do this. And when I think of like the real the foundation, the bedrock of advocacy, I think of these 3 things. Advocacy is relationship building. Advocacy is also education. And advocacy is playing to strengths. That's how you can be most successful. So real quick, just a couple bullet points on each of them. Building relationships. Washington, D.C. Congress has this unearned, I think, reputation, I would argue, for being transactional. We hear that how it's just like this for that, quid pro quo, et cetera. And real, honest, legitimate, sustainable policymaking is built on relationships, and it's built on trust. People are going to work across the aisle in a bipartisan fashion when they know and trust that other person as an honest broker. They're going to take information from advocates when they know that those advocates are credible sources of information in a state or district and when they're doing good work. And so building the relationships is important because we don't necessarily know when Congress is going to act on a bill or when a member or a senator is going to need that information. I spent 4 years on the Hill, 5 years total with a member of Congress, 4 years on the Hill. And it was very infrequent that or it was, excuse me, it was very frequent that my boss would come to me and say, hey, I want to go do a floor speech on X issue. Give me some local data. Give me some talking points. Or noticing that there's going to be a markup in a committee on a bill, and you only have 4 or 5 days maybe to figure out how that markup is going to affect the community. As advocates, we don't have the luxury of being able to foresee when those opportunities are going to arise in Congress or in a congressional office or in a Senate office. So we want to have built that relationship. So when they do arise, the first light bulb that goes off in a staffer's head is, oh, I got to contact that organization down there. I gotta get in touch with that person who's on the board of this organization, because that's when we're going to be able to provide real value to the process. A bit about education. At any given time, 35, 40, 45% of Congress is serving a first or a second term. I think this Congress has 50 or so freshman members in both the House and the Senate. I don't remember the exact number. Point being, they are not experts on any policy that you might be working on, or even the community in which you live or the state in which you live. So when we go up there and we do advocacy, we're also teaching them about their constituency. We cannot take for granted that they're going to understand how a given policy is going to impact the community. We have to tell them, we have to bring that information to them. Back in December, I was in a meeting with a senator's office doing some child tax credit advocacy. And the staffer had been on the Hill for 7 years. She knew tax policy inside and out. She was with that senator's office for less than a month. And she admitted on the call, hey, I'm great with this policy. My boss is on board, but I came from X. I don't know the first thing about the state. So any data, any feedback, any information that you could provide to me about the state reality would be really valuable. So we can't take for granted that even the staffers are going to know or be really well versed about the community or the state. That's why we're doing education at the same time that we're doing advocacy. And the last thing is we want to play to strengths, that we sound most credible and we provide the best information when two things are at play. When we're rooted in our faith, so we're coming from a position of genuine, rooted concern for the life and dignity of people in our community, A. And B, when we're talking about the work that we do, the importance and the value of information gets diminished when you're trying to weigh in on something that you don't necessarily know about. So we want to always play to our strengths. And that again goes back to the building relationships, because when we can play to our strengths, congressional offices will know, oh, those are the folks that have the really good information that I need. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ingrid before we move on to the next slide.
Thank you. And just to kind of build on that a little bit, when I did lobby for the Florida bishops, it's not all the time, and it's really easy to get frustrated, right, with politics, but it does make an impact. I've seen it with my eyes. I've heard it with my ears, right? There were times that I was in a member's office and the member was about to go vote on a bill in a committee, and I heard the staffer say, you know what, you just got 1,000 calls or emails in support of this bill and 800 against, right? So your advocacy does matter, right? They take that into consideration. I remember just this one particular bill that would require unanimous juries in Florida for death penalty cases. Before then, Florida had the lowest standard in the country by which someone could be sentenced to death. And there was a senator who was pro-death penalty, who was a former prosecutor, who opposed that bill. And I had multiple meetings with this man, basically saying the same things around this bill. But like Tom was saying, right, we have to build relationships and mutual respect and understanding. And because we were able to build that, finally, probably like on the 10th meeting, saying the same stuff on the same bill, he finally opened up a crack and told me why he opposed my bill. And I was able to address that issue. And all of a sudden, not only did he support this bill, he was our biggest advocate, to the point that he, a former prosecutor, former prosecutor basically berated like the Prosecutors Association when they came up in committee and opposed the bill. And that was only because, again, we built a relationship because we invested our time and our energy. So advocacy does make an impact. And I can't encourage you enough to get out there and to become involved in advocacy. And if I can ask Tom on the next slide to maybe highlight your website.
Yeah, just the pitch that if you want to get more involved with, or at least hear what the Jesuits are up to on the Hill, you can go to our website. We have breakdowns of all of the policy priorities that we work on, as well as a way to sign up for our Justice and Policy newsletter, as well as our action alerts.
And I'll highlight the USCCB Action Center as well. This is where you can get an email if there's an issue that we're working on at the federal level, where you can reach out to your member of Congress, let them know where the Catholic Church stands on that issue. The Catholic Social Ministry Gathering, there's actually our next one is scheduled at the end of this month, the 28th through the 31st. Online registration is closed, but you can show up and register on site, where again you get to learn about just social justice, both the advocacy and the on the ground work, and you get to meet with members of Congress on the last day of that. Again, federal policy at the USCCB. So I also encourage you to find your state Catholic conference and kind of follow their lead and know what they're working on at the state level. And you can find out who your elected members are. This is for congressional members if you want to go to this link, but of course, I encourage you to also find your state members to get involved. And with that, I'll hand it off to our friend, Christy Williams.
Thank you, Ingrid and Tom, for that excellent overview. Again, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. And thanks to Ingrid and Tom for giving us such a very comprehensive overview of Catholic social teaching, scripture, and how all that informs Catholic organizations' advocacy on social justice issues. I am Christy Williams. I am a senior manager for social policy and government affairs here at Catholic Charities USA. I've been in this position for a year today. I know, a year to the date. And I lead the organization's advocacy on restorative justice issues and policies. And so I just want to talk a little bit about Catholic Charities, Restorative Justice Ministries, the Catholic Charities Network, and the work that the Catholic Charities agencies do in the restorative justice and criminal justice space. Many of you may already be familiar with the work of Catholic Charities because you partner with them in your local communities. But I also want to tie that into the advocacy that we do here at CCUSA at the federal level, and really touch on examples of legislation that we have worked on in collaboration with the USCCB, the Jesuit Conference, and other faith-based partners here in DC, and then tell you how you can stay in touch with us and be informed about our work and get involved. So the Catholic Charities, is the social services arm of the Catholic Church in the United States. Catholic Charities agencies carry out social service ministries, providing wraparound services to the community. And there are 160 Catholic Charities agencies across the country with service locations, over 3,000 service locations in all 50 states, all territories, and Washington, D.C., providing, again, wraparound services to people that are in prison or involved in the justice system, to those that are touched by the justice system, either through a relative who's involved in the system, and really working with people or young people particularly who may need some support to avoid being involved in the justice system. And so this ministry, again, as I mentioned, many of you already work with your local Catholic charities to provide these services across the country. country, but I just want to highlight, a little bit of the impact that the Catholic Charities Network makes in the social justice space. So again, our agencies serve individuals and families that are touched by the criminal justice system. And so just drawing your attention to some of the numbers, the agencies serve returning citizens annually, about 25,000 people that are re-entering society, providing support as they're reintegrating into society, whether that means assisting with job placement, housing support, mental health, behavioral health support, connecting them with their families to rebuild those relationships that were strained over the years that they were incarcerated. The agencies also serve over 200,000 youth in their delinquency prevention programs, again, to provide support so that these young people can avoid being involved in the justice system, and so that they can go on to reach their highest potential and become contributing members to society. And then many of you, again, already know this, Catholic Charities agencies run prison ministry programs in about half the states, and partner with many of you and other faith-based organizations to go inside of prisons and jails and really speak to and nourish spiritually the people that are incarcerated, and give them hope and give them support as they're going through this journey in their lives. And so about 100 of the Catholic Charities agencies nationwide actually do provide services to people that are involved in the criminal legal system across the country. And so that is the service component of the Catholic Charities Network in this space. But then when it looks to the advocacy piece of it, which is why we're here today, right, to talk about advocacy, Catholic Charities USA advocates at the federal level for transformative policies to our legal system with a restorative justice approach, right? So what does that mean? Essentially, it's really looking at how we can look at our federal policies and make changes to them to first hold people, accountable, but to also give them grace and uphold their human dignity, their inherent human dignity, uphold their dignity, and still give them that opportunity to be rehabilitated and return to society and contribute positively to their communities. And so it's the whole package where we're looking at different points in our federal legal system where we're looking for opportunities to make those transformative changes to ensure that we're giving people hope and an opportunity to, again, transform their communities positively. And so when we talk about restorative justice, one of the first things that come to mind, one of the legislation that we recently partnered with some of our faith-based partners here on this call, as well as others that are not with us today, is the First Step Act. And this is a bill that I'm so proud to share, the work that the Catholic Charities Network did, and Catholic Charities itself, Catholic Charities USA did, in advocating for the advancement and the passage of this bill. So this bill essentially is just the first step to reforming our criminal legal system. Again, upholding human dignity, holding people accountable, and rehabilitating people so that they can re-enter society and transform communities in a positive way. This speaks to what Ingrid and Tom talked about earlier, which is, again, visiting people at their lowest moment in prison, clothing them, giving them the support that they need to get through very difficult times, responding and bringing to life Matthew 25, right, through advocacy. And so that's what this bill does. And I'll just go over some of the key points quickly, just to give you some highlights of key provisions in this bill and how transformative it is to our federal legal system. So some key takeaways. First, this bill was signed into law by President Trump in 2018. Key takeaways from this bill, it required the Department of Justice to develop a system to assess prisoners' recidivism in the federal prison system, and then just determine whether or not, depending on the individual's eligibility, give them an opportunity to participate in positive and transformative programs while they're in prison. And through their participation of those programs, such as job training programs, college classes, for example, getting their GED, and other programs within the prison system, they would then be granted time credits and potentially be allowed to be released or complete their sentences in pre-release settings, such as residential housing or temporary or transitional housing programs to complete their sentences. And so this is certainly important in that, again, it goes to that restorative justice piece where you're looking at the you're looking at the whole person, right? Protecting the dignity of the whole person, giving them an opportunity to transform internally as well as acquire the skills that they need to return to society and contribute positively. The bill also reduced mandatory minimum sentences for certain drug offenses. So there were some drug offenses that required mandatory 20-year sentences, minimum 20-year sentences, and the bill reduced those minimum sentences to about 15 years. The bill also prohibited the use of restraints on pregnant women that were in custody. And this, again, goes to that human dignity piece. So what Ingrid talked about, what Tom talked about, advocacy really leads to how people that are involved in the justice system are treated. And so that's why this bill was also important to the Catholic Charities USA, ensuring that people are treated with dignity. And the last point that I want to highlight in this bill is the bill also reauthorized the Second Chance Act of 2017 to provide grants for reentry support. In 2007, when the Second Chance Act was approved by Congress, that act made available funding, grant funding to state and local government, as well as charitable organizations that are working to support the reentry of returning citizens into society. And of course, the funding had dwindled over the years. And so this bill came along and reauthorized the Second Chance Act to provide robust funding for reentry support services across the country. Again, many of you probably work alongside your local Catholic Charities agencies and other nonprofit agencies that tap into grant funding for the Second Chance Act to support people as they're returning to society. And so we were very, very grateful to work alongside our partners from USCCB, our friends at Prison Fellowship, and other faith-based organizations to really champion this bill and get it through the process. And so we're happy to see it become a law. The next bill that I want to touch on is the Equal Act. And the Equal Act is another sentencing reform measure that was put forth, was introduced, and I believe it was introduced initially in the House by Representative Hakeem Jeffries. And the bill really aimed to create fairness in our sentencing laws as they relate to drug offenses, and address some of the racial disparities in federal drug sentencing laws. And so just to start off with what the bill does. The bill was designed to repeal disparity in sentencing laws for crack and powder cocaine. As you know, there's huge disparities between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, which the sentencing of crack cocaine and powder cocaine disproportionately affect racial minorities. Currently, the current law on the books right now basically states that an individual who has been convicted of a drug-related crime involving about 28 grams of crack cocaine will get the same sentence as somebody who is convicted of a drug-related crime which involved powder cocaine of about 500 grams. Obviously, 28 grams is significantly less than 500 grams. However, current law states that they get the same sentence. And so historically, this law disproportionately impacted racial minorities like Black and brown people who historically were convicted of crack cocaine related offenses. And you may be wondering, well, what does this have to do with Catholic Charities or a Catholic organization? Why is this important? Well, really it's an issue of fairness and human dignity. Equal crimes, equal offenses should be treated equally and punished equally. And so that's why this is important to, Catholic Charities USA, essentially advocating for the fairness within our legal system so that nobody will be treated differently for other reasons, right? And so this bill was introduced again in the House. It passed the House overwhelmingly. And it made it in to the Senate, and it was a bumpy ride in the Senate. There were several times where we thought we had enough votes, bipartisan votes, to get this through the Senate. And then at the very last minute, it just did not seem possible. We were hoping to get it in the omnibus bill that just passed in Congress in December, and that was not possible. But this bill remains a priority because, again, upholding human dignity, advocating for fairness in our laws is a priority and really advances, our Catholic beliefs, where treating people equally is upholding people's human dignity. And so as one of our priorities for the 118th Congress, CCUSA is going to work alongside all of our faith-based partners again to work to get this bill reintroduced, because now we're in a new Congress, and work with some of our friends on the Hill to see how this bill can be advanced quickly through the 118th Congress. So since my colleague David has not made it yet, David Jimenez with Prison Fellowship was supposed to be here today to chat with us about another bill that we all worked on as a collective here in DC to advance through the congressional process. And since he's not here, I'll just go ahead and take a stab at it quickly, just to give you, another win to add to the collection of examples I've shared with you today, to highlight some of the issues that we've worked on here at the federal level and how our collaborative efforts really advances our Catholic mission. So the most recent win that I am really proud and happy to share with you that we were able to get through the last Congress through the omnibus bill is the Law Enforcement De-Escalation Act. And I'll just go ahead and read the bill numbers for your reference. So the Senate version is S4003 and the House version is HR 8637. And this bill really aimed at creating a federal grant program to incentivize state and local law enforcement agencies to invest in training programs and training initiatives for their officers to develop de-escalation tactics as they're responding to crisis calls in the community. I'm sure all of you are aware and have seen so many reports out there in the media about police responding to crisis call, especially for mental health crisis, where things just escalated to where the person in distress ended up becoming hurt or was killed. And we saw this bill as an opportunity to really advocate for the necessary funding for law enforcement agencies across the country that may not necessarily have the funding to properly train their officers to be able to adequately respond to these kinds of calls in the community, and to fund collaboration and partnership between law enforcement agencies as well as mental health providers and experts who can assist them as they respond to these calls. And so I'm so excited to share that we worked alongside the USCCB, the Jesuit Conference, Prison Fellowship, and again, other faith-based organizations to advance this bill through both the Senate and the House, and it was signed into law last December as part of the omnibus package. Again, why is this important to Catholic organizations on this call? It's important because it would certainly provide necessary resources, again, to provide that support that the most vulnerable people in society really need to be able to participate in community with dignity, and equipping our law enforcement agencies with the resources they need to serve some of the most vulnerable members of our society is important, is our mission, is a priority to us. And so we were really excited to get this through Congress. I want to leave you with some information to stay in touch with us, so that way you can be involved in Catholic Charities advocacy here at the federal level. A lot of what we do here at the federal level affects what you do locally. You are the ones in the field providing the services. You're the ones serving your community. You're the ones seeing firsthand what's happening in a community that should be informing the advocacy that we're doing here in DC. As the previous speakers talked about, it's important to educate lawmakers and their staffers about some of the policies that they're adopting at the federal level and how that really translates into your communities. And so please stay in touch with Catholic Charities USA. To sign up for our action alerts, please text CCUSA to 50457. We send out action alerts all the time about issues here in DC. And if you want to participate and engage your lawmaker, please do so. And then we also send out weekly updates, policy updates, just to tell you what's happening in DC, so that way you can keep up to date on the happenings here. So sign up for our Washington Weekly, and please free to reach out to me directly if you just want to hear about our advocacy, the priorities that we're working on, and some of our friends that we're advocating alongside on some of these issues, and how they really affect the work that you're doing. I would love to hear from you, and looking forward to staying in touch. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to Emma Tacke.
Thank you, Christy. If there's ever a better example of the 2 feet of charity and justice than Catholic Charities, I cannot think of one. So thank you, Christy, for all the amazing work you're doing. And likewise, thank you, Ingrid and Father Dustin. And I was sorry to see Tom go, but I think really what the crux of what we're talking about today is how does our advocacy promote and uphold human dignity, which is really what our Catholic faith motivates us to do. So I am here today to talk about that desire and that motivation and that goal through the policy lens of the death penalty. For those who are unfamiliar with Catholic Mobilizing Network, we are the national Catholic organization working to end the use of the death penalty and promote restorative justice. Since 2009, through education, advocacy, and prayer, CMN has been working to eliminate capital punishment, which we see as the most punitive, violent, and dehumanizing practice in our legal system. of which there are many dehumanizing practices. And at the same time, we work to uplift responses to harm that are consistent with our gospel and align with Catholic social teaching principles. Through close collaboration with our friends at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and emboldened by the untiring support of the Congregation of St. Joseph, CMN engages the Catholic community in impactful efforts to abolish the death penalty. And we can go on to the next slide, and thank you, Kara, for helping the slides today. So based on the gospel value that all human life is created in the image and likeness of God, CMN expresses the fundamental belief that all those who have caused or been impacted by crime should be treated with dignity. So for a long time, the official church teaching maintained that the death penalty was appropriate only under the very rare circumstances where a death sentence was the only way of safeguarding the common good. But as our standards of decency have really evolved throughout time and societies have ensured structures in place to protect society from individuals who have caused great harm, the church's 3 most recent popes have all made public statements calling for the worldwide abolition of the death penalty. And on August 2nd, 2018, building on the teachings of Pope St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI, Pope Francis and the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith formalized that the death penalty is inadmissible. This revised text of the Catholic Catechism really crystallized the Church's teaching on capital punishment. Next slide, please. So we will get into some strong advocacy actions you can take in a few minutes. But first, I want to spend a few minutes reviewing the current status of the death penalty. For those who, if you are new to this issue, and I know there are many in the audience who have been working on this issue for a long time, 2/3 of states in the country have moved away from the practice of capital punishment. We have 3 moratorium states, California, Oregon, and Pennsylvania. You see here are in kind of the dark or the dark gray area. And then when I say moratorium state, I mean that the governor of the state can declare that while they are governor, there will be no executions under their leadership. But just this week, under a new governor in the state of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania has actually scheduled an execution date for March 2023. So this development just reiterates how vigilant we must be in states, even where we may be tempted to consider them safe from executions. Things can really turn on a dime in this movement to end the death penalty. And then the states you see here on this map that are in red still have the death penalty on the books, but even for those states, about a dozen have not executed anyone in a decade. And then there are 23 states that have abolished the death penalty. And apologize, I am a little, just to reiterate the numbers here, I'm used to working from a different map. The dark blue states are the states that have abolished the death penalty. The moratorium states are in that light grayish blue color. The tan states are states where there has not been an execution in over 10 years. And then those red states are active death penalty states. So I encourage you to take a look at this map and see where your state falls on the death penalty. Moving on to the next slide. There are approximately 2,500 people on death row nationally as of October 1st, 2020. And there are several factors that come into play when determining who is put on death row. Racial bias, unsurprisingly, against defendants of color and in favor of white victims has a strong effect of who is capitally prosecuted, sentenced to death, and executed. Additionally, people with intellectual disability, serious mental illness, and those who cannot afford strong legal representation are also more at risk. In 2018, more than 70% of the people executed showed evidence of serious mental illness, brain damage, intellectual impairment, or chronic abuse and trauma. So it really throws into light who are we executing, who are we saying deserves to be put on death row, which for Catholics, it's no one deserves to be put on death row, no matter the harm they may have caused. 190 people have been exonerated from death row since 1973. And then in addition to states using the death penalty, the federal government also has the jurisdiction to condemn people to death. Prior to July 2020, it had been 17 years since the last federal execution. But under the Trump administration, the federal government has executed 13 people in the span of 6 months. So that the federal death penalty is something we will talk about more in a minute, and kind of opportunities that are around motivating Biden to end the death penalty as well. Okay, looking again here at this next map we have on this next slide, I think what's interesting for many people to learn is how truly geographically isolated the death penalty is. We're seeing about 2% of counties are responsible for 59% of death row. So there are clear geographic differences in death penalty usage across the country and within individual states. From the time executions resumed in 1977 through April 2020, 82% of all executions in the US have taken place in the South. Between January 2015 through April 2020, there were only 5 states, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and Missouri, were responsible for 83% of all executions in the US. And even within a state, the death penalty is usually pursued in only a handful of counties, though the expense of those death sentences is often shared by all the taxpayers of that state. Looking here at the next slide, we do see that there are trends that are with us when it comes to ending the death penalty. The numbers are in our favor. But however, the states that do retain the death penalty on the books are going to be the most difficult to move on this issue, which is why we need your help and support here. So this red line you see on this chart is the number of annual death sentences each year. In 2009, there were 118 death sentences. Today, we hover at about 30 death sentences each year, an encouraging sign. The blue line you see is the number of annual executions each year. In 2009, there were 52 executions, and that number has been cut by more than half today. So as you can see, we are seeing progress, and we're hopeful that this issue is one that we can resolve in the next several years. One of the reasons I enjoy working on capital punishment abolition is because it does feel winnable and achievable. Like together we can make this happen, which is a hopeful way to work. And then I just wanted to make note in terms of abolition milestones. This was very exciting, and it's not noted here yet on this chart, but the latest win towards ending the death penalty happened just last month when Oregon Governor Kate Brown commuted the sentences of the 17 individuals who remained on the state's death row to life without the possibility of parole. So that was a welcome milestone in terms of making sure that people were not going to be executed. And looking here at the next slide, we do have some examples of states we have on our radar, either due to recent wins, opportunities ahead, or challenges we're monitoring closely. For example, Florida will be working toward passing legislation that would prevent the execution of people with serious mental illness. If passed, the state would be following in the footsteps of Kentucky, which in 2022 became the second state in the US to prohibit the execution of those with serious mental illness. And you may be wondering, well, what was the first state? It was Ohio, which we're also very hopeful. Ohio passed legislation in 2021 to prohibit the execution of those with serious mental illness. And in the last couple of years, they've really been working hard towards abolishing their death penalty as well. So we're expecting to see fresh repeal bills in the Ohio legislature for 2023. And then in Oklahoma, it's a state that we are watching closely and where intense advocacy is needed. The state resumed executions in 2021 after a 7-year hiatus. In July 2022, the state scheduled 25 executions to be carried out over the next 2 years. More on how you could take action to stop executions in just a couple moments here. And then looking here at this next slide, here's what we're seeing on the federal level. There is also opportunity to advocate for a consistent ethic of life where all human dignity is upheld. President Biden, a Catholic, is the first US president to have campaigned on an open anti-death penalty platform. His administration in June 2021 was the first to declare an official moratorium on federal executions, which this was a most welcome development after the federal execution spree we saw in 2020. And yet, there is more to be done. There's more we can encourage President Biden to do. Despite the president's anti-death penalty platform and the moratorium, his Department of Justice is still actively defending the death sentences of the 42 people currently on the federal death row and are pursuing new death sentences as well. This is really a sobering reality and reminder that the door to future federal executions is still wide open and still something we need to take seriously. So one of the strongest actions President Biden can do, who, he's well into his presidency, midterms are over, like, let's get something done. We want him to fulfill his promise to dismantle the federal death penalty using his executive power, commute the death sentences of those on federal death row. Additionally, we want him to work with Congress to abolish the federal death penalty and encourage states with the practice still on the books to end the death penalty as well. So here is the text of this petition we have addressed to President Biden. You can see here in the text, which we launched a few months before he declared a moratorium on federal executions, that we wanted him to declare a moratorium, which he did, and we want him to commute the federal death row and work with Congress to really get this practice off the books on the federal level. So if we go to the next slide here, that's one of the advocacy actions we have for you here today, is to sign the petition addressed to President Biden, encouraging him to be strong on the federal death penalty. And then I have gone over my time limit here, but I just wanted to name a couple more resources on the next slide. Thank you, Kara. Here we again have the messaging of the federal death penalty is as broken as it is on the state level. It's arbitrary, racially biased, out of step with the national trends we're seeing towards declining death sentences and executions. And then it's the next slide here that we have a couple more resources. So again, please sign our petition addressed to President Biden. And then I also encourage you to sign up to receive state-specific legislative alerts that you can take within your state to contact your legislators around upcoming or current repeal or abolition legislation to end the death penalty. And then we also have our Mercy in Action project, which is a monthly email that we send around that encourages people to advocate and raise their voice in support of those who have scheduled execution dates, and to really contact state decision makers to say, not in my name do I want to see this execution go through, and I oppose it for these reasons. So with that, I will hand things over to Father Dustin, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Christy and Ingrid and Tom, to our really amazing panelists that have clearly made it obvious that we have so many different, at least, opportunities to engage in advocacy, like you all have mentioned, and Ingrid, as you were kind of demonstrating in your own experience, how it changed the vote of a significant state senator, I believe it was. So this just goes to show that this is gospel work. And I know we're kind of close to time here, but and maybe this is a discussion that we can have another time, but we don't have time to go into it right now. But as you all were talking, I was thinking, in a time when we know there is such ideological extremes, not only in the country, but in the church, what are some of your stories and some of maybe the challenges that you found in doing advocacy work around these issues in parishes and among people in the community that maybe are much more open to thinking certain issues as issues that they are happy to advocate for, but then hearing the church is advocating issues related to the death penalty, but certainly, Christy, as you mentioned too, into questions of economic justice as well, or the equal act. Each criminal act should be as equal as possible, so that there is not racial injustice, certainly, and economic injustice as well involved in it. So anyways, this has opened up a lot of kind of questions, but we'll have to have that for another time. And so we are again, so appreciative that you all joined us today. And I know that we're going to be making use of the resources that you all have shared. A recording of this will be sent out via email to all of those that are signed up through CPMC's newsletters. And also, I believe we have, Kara, a few announcements to share as well, some things that will be kind of coming up here soon. We have this financial empowerment and capacity building youth and family. It's a two-part webinar series, Your Money, Your Goals, Resources for Families and Youth. And this is with Catholic Charities, Christy, right? So we're thankful for all the good work that you all are doing there. And then Resources for Older Youth on Tuesday, January 31st. So that's coming up here in the next week, 2 weeks. And then we have this is something sponsored by the CPMC here, Reentry, Your Money, Your Goals, which is a training in finding opportunities that are out there for, especially for those that are reentering and families that are affected by those that are caught up in the criminal justice system. So this sounds like a very practical opportunity for us that are work with those that are reentering and those that are affected to be able to support family. And that's February 8th, part 1, and then February 9th for the second part. And then I believe we have, we have the foundational formation is beginning again, starting on February 20th. So for those of you that are feel called to minister to those that are affected by incarceration and detention, these foundational trainings are really invaluable in terms of the resources, the theology, the practical kind of pastoral work that goes on in volunteering and supporting those that are affected by the criminal justice system. So feel free to find out more information at CPMC's website for that coming up foundational formation training. And then finally, we have our next webinar, our coming up webinar series here. Of course, we have the Advocacy Network, which was today. And then we have here Father Stan, who will be discussing how ministers can accompany juveniles on March 2nd. And essentially, as I've learned working with those, really what we should use with that term is children, working with children that are caught up in the criminal justice system. So that's going to be a very important webinar. And then, of course, we have the wonderful Father Jim Martin, who will be sharing on how to minister to LGBTQ youth that are caught up in the system as well, which that is a pressing issue and just some of the experiences that I've had as well. So looking forward to that webinar as well. So again, we're starting off 2023 with trying to provide as many resources to all of us and to all of you that are doing such extraordinary work, ministering to the least among us, to those sisters and brothers that are incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, and otherwise detained. So many thanks again, Ingrid, Christy, Emma, Tom, David, had he been able to make it, but for all the work that you all are doing on a daily basis and promoting the kingdom of God. So blessings and prayers to you all in your respective ministries and to all of those that have participated in today's webinar. All right, God's peace.